Joining me now is Eric Farnsworth, Vice President of the Council for the Americas and the Americas Society. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks very much.
Now, as we heard, there are a lot of negative publicity leading up to the Games. Venues not ready, pollution in the water and such, obviously Zika, the political situation. But now that the Games are actually underway, what's the reality?
I think it's a really important point. Before the Games actually begin, the only storyline is preparations for the Games. And by definition, they're not going to be ready before they need to be ready, before the Games start. So the news is going to be bad. It's not to say that that's not unjustified. There have been some problems. There have been some hiccups, right? You mentioned some of the environmental issues, particularly Guanabara Bay has not been cleaned up as the organizers promised it would be. There are some problems in terms of infrastructure being delayed and such. But as the Games are now beginning, the storyline is going to change. People are going to focus on the competition, the excitement, the opening ceremonies. There's going to be a different feel, a different vibe. And I think you're going to see some of that very real anxiety before the game transition now into some excitement about the Games themselves.
So perhaps people blowing it a bit out of proportion. This is actually normal when it comes to preps for Olympics.
It's very normal. It's very common. In fact, if you look at the Games that have preceded the Rio Games, whether it's London or whether it's Beijing or whether it's Atlanta or Athens, Australia, Sydney, right? There's always this concern that the organizers are not going to be ready, the venues won't be ready on time. And at the end of the day, for the most part, the Games go on, and at the end of them, people congratulate the organizers, say what a great success. So we're hoping for the same thing in Rio.
And Eric, speaking about the previous Summer Games that you mentioned, some of them, London, Beijing, and others, but we see that Brazil is doing things more on a budget. How much of that is about showing that you can do this without really splashing the cash versus the deep recession that Brazil is in?
Well, they're directly related, because when Brazil was first given the Games or awarded the Games in 2009, it was riding high. The economy was doing really well, approaching double-digit growth, historic highs in terms of poverty alleviation, middle class, millions of people literally joining the middle class that previously hadn't been able to do that. Much of that was reliant on the commodities trade, and the reason why the Olympics organizers felt that they'd be able to have the money to put on a successful Games was because of oil, right, in the deep water. And a lot of that revenue was geared toward putting on the Games. Well, we know what's happened to the price of oil. It's gone from about $120 a barrel down to about $40 a barrel.
Right.
So the revenue is not there. So they've had to adjust, but they've done so successfully, and I think for the most part we'll be pleased.
Now, what about, let's take a more forward-looking look. As we look at the economic boost, perhaps, that these Games could have on Rio, what sort of industries do you think could really benefit?
Well, there are some things that have been done reasonably well in terms of infrastructure, transportation, redevelopment of the Olympic site itself, so that's real estate. But there are large parts of Rio that unfortunately aren't going to be directly touched by the Games in terms of some of the expectations, some of the hopes of what the benefits and the legacy of the Games might be. So I think it's going to be mixed. I think that there will be some, probably some expectations that aren't fully met. At the same time, we have to put this into perspective, recognize what has been done, recognize what continues to need to be done. But I think by and large, the Games will leave a positive legacy for the community.
And speaking of a positive legacy, it's important to recognize that Brazil is the first South American country to host the Games. What do you think this means for the country and the region as a whole? Well,
and it's only the second time that a country in Latin America has hosted the Games. The first one was Mexico City in 1968. I think Brazil is, the eyes of the world are clearly watching Brazil, and if they can pull this off, and I think that they will, but if they can pull this off, it will be another sign of Latin America rising in the global community, able to really concentrate to develop successful events. Rio, we have to remember, this isn't the first time Rio has done a successful event. They're good at giving parties, right? The World Cup in 2014, the Pope's visit, the Pan American Games, we could go on and on. Rio knows what it's like to have the eyes of the world. This is a little bit different. It's a little bit more intense, but I think at the end of the day, they'll get there.
Now, just lastly, as we see these events, they bring in a lot of investment, a lot of attention to the host cities. And when Brazil was deciding to host the Games, obviously they were riding high. So with that being said, so that you're still inclusive of other countries that want to perhaps pursue this, how much weight should be given to a country's economic situation when these host cities are given out?
Well, I think you have to take it into account, but the lag time between when the announcement is made that a city has been selected and the time when the games are actually put on is unpredictable. I mean, 7 years is a long time, and anything can happen, as we know, in terms of global economic conditions. So, yeah, you have to take into account a country's capacity to be able to do this, and more importantly, the local community's capacity, because it's the local community that's ultimately responsible for doing this. But it's fundamentally impossible to predict the future and to say what's the global economy or the national economy going to look like in 7 years from now. So a lot of this is based on faith and the capacity of a country really to pull off a major event like this in the global context.
Certainly hard to predict, especially in this global economy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. Eric Farnsworth, Vice President of the Council of the Americas and Americas Society.